Hello, and welcome back to the Development Book Club. Today we're continuing with boundaries. We're going to finish the first section of the book today. And there are 3 chapters, a ton of really good takeaways. The first one we're going to talk about is this idea of how boundaries are developed in childhood and adolescence. We'll also talk about the 10 laws of boundaries and then myths concerning boundaries. So those 3 chapters today. The first one is the most dense, and then the second 2 are a little easier. So let's begin with chapter 4. How boundaries are developed. And this is the idea that they're developed, that they are not inherited, they are built. And there's this an analogy, and they take a look at childhood development. So the first phase of childhood development is bonding. And this begins with our fundamental need and part of our nature about needing relationships. And that the first task of an infant is to bond with their mom and dad. They learn that they are welcome and safe in the world if everything is done properly, and that mom and dad need to provide a consistent, warm, loving, and predictable emotional environment for the child to set a good foundation. So at this point, the baby could verbalize it, would think that mommy and me are the same. Phase 2, separation and individuation. So this begins like after about a year and up until 3 years of life for the infant. So they have this internal sense of safety from the first phase of bonding, and a second need will arise. Sort of, we think about how Maslow's hierarchy of needs, where these needs emerge once lower needs are met. So this is the baby's need for autonomy will emerge, and this idea of separation, that the child is able at this point to perceive themselves as not me. Perceive the mom or dad as not me, and then they're individuating themselves as me. So there's a difference there, or there's a separateness. So hatching is phase 3, and this is where the infant realizes that mommy and me, different and not the same. Phase 4 is practicing the I can do anything phase. This could be anywhere from 10 months to 18 months, where the hatching baby is overwhelmed by this new world and still leans a great deal on the mom. The practicing child at this level is trying to leave her behind. So, and the idea here is that good parents in this phase firmly and consistently set realistic boundaries with their children in this period, not spoiling them, without spoiling their enthusiasm for learning what's new out in the world, all these new things, other differentiation. Now, the final phase is rapprochement, which is the idea or the realization that I can't do everything, and that can be anywhere 18 months to 3 years. And this is restoring this harmonious relations. And the child comes back to reality, and they realize that they still need the mom. So there's this separateness. There's just initially a bonding, and then a realization of a separateness. And then sort of, if you can think, there's rebellion and going out and running away, and then coming back, rapprochement. The child returns to the mom, but this time it's more as a separate sense of self. And then so the idea is that by the age of 3 things should be happening. That the child is emotionally attached without losing a sense of their own self. They can say no to their parents without fearing a loss of love or a withdrawal from their parents, and that they can hear no without themselves withdrawing emotionally. That's like the goal there, right? So this is most evident in 3-year-olds, and it also comes up again in adolescence and in young adulthood. So that's kind of the phase of boundary development. And then to finish the first chapter here, the idea is there are boundary injuries. What can go wrong? Many things can go wrong here. So there can be a withdrawal from boundaries, which is to say that it's important for the parents that when there are disagreements, the kids doing the practicing phase and experimentation, it does not result in a withdrawal of love from the parents. The children need to, they say, suffer age-appropriate consequences for acting out. Maybe have age-appropriate consequences for acting out. If the parents pull away in hurt, disappointment, passive rage, all that stuff, they're sending this message. This is say that you're lovable when you behave, but you aren't lovable when you don't behave. And that creates a wound in the child. That can be traumatic. So children of parents like that often grow up to be adults that are terrified that setting boundaries will cause isolation and abandonment, because this is what they're taught when they're young, that if they draw lines or they do things wrong, they are withdrawn from. So also, hostility against boundaries just really quickly would be that the children they're denied the benefit of being trained at that point. They don't learn that delayed gratification and being responsible can have benefits. So instead of, for example, saying, "Oh, look, you either make your bed You're going to be grounded for a month. You can say, you have a choice. You can make your bed and I'll let you play Nintendo, or you can not make your bed and you'll lose your Nintendo privileges for the rest of the day. Another way things can go wrong, over control. This occurs when the parents have too strict of rules because they're afraid of something. They need to control and protect their kid, so they keep the leash too tight, so to speak. There's also a lack of limits, and this is the child whose parents are always give them their way. The parents can't say no, and that comes from their own childhood. This lack of parental boundaries it's the opposite of hostility. The child isn't able to act this way by the rewards that they get, and they get their way. And those people will often continue to do this and expect this into adulthood, which makes for not so pleasant adults. Inconsistent limits. This is very common in alcoholic families. Causes boundary confusion in the child, and they never grow up feeling safe in relationships. They're always waiting for their partner, which their parents have done, to either let them down or to attack them unexpectedly, depending on whatever their mood is. And lastly, this idea of trauma, which is an intensely painful emotional experience. So all the other examples have been sort of character pattern problems of limit setting, but trauma is different. So if a person's like a tree, all the previous examples would be like not getting proper nutrients or enough sunlight or something. And trauma is more like a lightning strike to the tree. Tough times. So it affects boundary development because it shakes up two necessary foundations that an infant needs for life, which is that the world is reasonably safe and that they have control of their lives. Chapter 5, the 10 laws of boundaries. I'm going to go through this pretty quickly. They're a bit haphazard in my opinion, but there's still something to be gained from each of them. So law number 1, which is the law of sowing and reaping, that you reap what you sow. With respect to boundaries, it has to do with this. People that interfere with other people and don't let them sow the results of their choices, they need to confront the people who are sowing and not nag them, but provide them with boundaries and subsequent consequences for their actions, as opposed to enabling them. So for example, like, I will no longer pay for your credit card bill, the responsibility is yours, as opposed to like a child who keeps overspending and the parent enables them by continuing it. The law of responsibility states that we're responsible to each other, but not for each other, kind of tying in with the first one. So we need to set limits on another's destructive and irresponsible behavior and let them feel the consequences of their actions. So again, we're just saying the same thing again. Number 3, the law of power, which says that while we cannot change others, we cannot choose for them, we cannot change them, we can influence them. And how to do that effectively in this context is that since we can't get them to change, we just change ourselves so that their destructive patterns no longer work on us in this relationship. So this idea, there's a dynamic going on. If we cut our end, which is the only thing we can control, it will change the dynamic as well. The power of respect is that we need to respect others' freedom and boundaries. The law number 5 of motivation is that we need to ask ourselves, be wise of what is the actual motives behind our love or our giving. And oftentimes it is fear. Fear of loss of love or abandonment, fear of another person's rage, all those things. Law number 6, the law of evaluation. Really cool one here, and it works on a metaphor too. We need to evaluate the effects of setting our boundaries. And this has to do with harm versus hurt. So for example, drilling a cavity out of your mouth, when the dentist does that, this definitely hurts, but does not harm the individual in a sense of the body, right? And likewise, eating all the candy that got you to that cavity did not hurt at all, but it did harm you. Really cool distinction. Law number 7, the law of proactivity. This is the idea that people will be compliant for years and years, and they'll finally blow up. And this reaction phase is necessary, but not sufficient for them to establish boundaries. And this is kind of like parallels the child going out and experimenting and trying and before approachment. But this blow up thing, it's super important to realize that it is a stage and not a fixed identity that just continues for the rest of life. So one must rejoin humanity and establish connections as equals, loving their neighbors and stuff. The law of envy, which is simply to say, when you don't have something, the best is to ask, why don't I have what I am envying? Internalize as opposed to externalize. The law of activity is number 9, which is this idea that we can either respond to things or initiate things. Our boundaries can only be created by being out and being active and aggressive and knocking, seeking, and asking. So this idea of proactivity and boundaries and activity. And number 10, the law of exposure, which says that our boundaries need to be visible to others and communicated to them in relationships. Because if we don't express them, they will be communicated indirectly or through manipulation. And it's sort of impossible to not have boundaries. or not have a stance on boundaries, let's say. So by doing nothing is actually a stance. Chapter 6, the final one, myths about boundaries. So there's a bunch of common incorrect ideas that would suggest boundaries are not needed, and here's a bunch of banging them down. So there are 8 of them, and we'll get those real quick, and we're done. Number 1, if I set boundaries, I am being selfish. Actually, is that appropriate boundaries actually increase our ability to care for others and to really do what's best for them. Myth number 2, boundaries are a sign of disobedience to others. People with shaky limits are often compliant on the outside, but rebellious and sinful on the inside, actually. So it's the opposite again. If I begin setting boundaries, I will hurt other people, is number 3. We don't want to hurt other people. But for people who believe in boundaries but are terrified of the consequences, think of boundaries as a litmus test for your relationships and the quality of them. If the only thing keeping someone in a relationship with you is total compliance, what is that? Not really a healthy relationship, right? So sometimes setting boundaries clarifies where you're at and that they may have left a long time ago in every way except for physically. And it may be it very well may be a rough path moving forward after setting limits, but in the end, it's a good thing. Bond first, set boundaries second. Myth number 4 is that if I set boundaries, I will hurt other people. And the idea here is that boundaries are defensive, not offensive. We think of like the property lines. Like property lines will go and attack people. It's more of like a stop for them. They're a defensive, not offensive tool. And that appropriate boundaries don't control, attack, or hurt anybody. Number 5, having boundaries would mean that I am angry. Not true. People setting boundaries for the first time in a while will likely feel anger as they begin to say no for the first time in a long time, because they will think back to that they should have been doing this, or all the problems, and they'll start telling themselves stories about it. And then as they become individuals with mature boundaries, this anger will pass. So the idea here is that don't get mad, get even. No, just kidding. Don't get mad, set a limit instead. And there's no need to get angry. We can be calm with this. Number 6, when other people set boundaries, that hurts me. Now the opposite. And then this is the idea that we project our injuries onto other people. Myth number 7, boundaries cause feelings of guilt. One major obstacle to setting boundaries with others in our lives is that we feel obligations to other people. And this is, again, with the last book we covered, Nonviolent Communication by Marshall Rosenberg. He really recommends not acting out of obligation, but out of need instead. So, and then this idea of causing guilt. If the giver was hurt or angry at sincere thanks, when somebody gives you something and you're like, thank you so much, and they're actually angry and they expect reciprocity, it probably wasn't a gift, but it was a loan, they say, which is a great distinction. And finally, number 8, boundaries are permanent, and I am afraid of burning bridges. So this idea is that our saying no is subject to us. We own our boundaries and they don't own us. If we set limits with somebody and they respond maturely and lovingly, we can always negotiate the boundary at a later point. In addition, we can change the boundary if we're in a safer place with ourselves. So that is the first section of boundaries. A ton of stuff in there. Thanks for watching all the way through. And we will continue next time with part 2.